weeds rolled past empty hitching posts, a lone figure appeared through the heat waves. A cowboy, his face weathered by years on the range, his eyes fixed on the woman who had lost everything. What this mysterious stranger would do next would become a legend told around campfires for generations to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell clutched the telegram until its edges crumpled, reading the words one more time, as if they might somehow change. The paper was cheap, the message brutal in its simplicity. Her fingers traced over the wrinkles in her carefully sewn wedding dress. 3 months of evening work by lamplight, transforming feed sacks into something that could pass for bridal finery. Now it seemed as foolish as her dreams. The station master's wife had been watching her for the past hour from behind the ticket counter, sympathy and judgment warring in her expression. Sarah straightened her spine, refusing to cry where others could see. She'd learned that lesson early in the Boston textile mill. Tears were a luxury working girls couldn't afford. She reached into her carpet bag, past the small bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, and pulled out her mother's worn Bible. Inside, pressed between the pages of Psalms, lay the last photograph ever taken of her family. Her father, strong and proud in his Union Army uniform, stood behind her mother's chair. Sarah, barely 12 then, stood beside them, her hand resting on her mother's shoulder. Within a year, influenza would claim them both, leaving her alone in a world that had little mercy for orphan girls. The memories of those years in the mill flooded back. The endless hours bent over sewing machines, the foreman's constant shouts, the choking dust that filled her lungs. But she'd survived, hadn't she? Saved every penny, taught herself proper letters by copying from discarded newspapers, dreamed of something better than the tenements and factory walls. Then Robert's first letter had arrived at the boarding house. Such beautiful penmanship, such gentle words about his ranch in Arizona Territory, his dreams of building something lasting. For 3 years, they'd exchanged letters, sharing hopes and plans. He'd even sent her $2 for a photograph, though he never sent one in return. "Too few photographers in these parts," he'd explained. Sarah touched the coins in her pocket. His last gift, along with the train ticket that had carried her away from everything familiar. $2.50 stood between her and destitution. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same amount he'd sent for her photograph would now have to keep her alive. The station master's grandfather clock struck 3, its chimes echoing through the near-empty building. Sarah gathered her meager belongings, knowing she couldn't linger much longer without drawing more unwanted attention. Through the dust-streaked windows, tombstones sprawled before her, a collection of wooden buildings and canvas tents with mountains rising like giants in the distance. She'd read about the West in dime novels snuck between factory shifts. Tales of adventure and opportunity, of wide-open spaces where a person could reinvent themselves. None of those stories had mentioned the crushing heat, the ever-present dust, or the hollow feeling of standing alone in a strange land with nothing but betrayed trust and a foolish white dress. A gust of wind rattled the station windows, carrying with it the sound of approaching horses. Sarah turned, half expecting, hoping despite herself, to see Robert riding up with some explanation for his cruel telegram. Instead, her eyes met those of the weathered cowboy who'd been watching from the platform's far end. He took a step forward, and Sarah felt the weight of her circumstances press down like a physical thing. She had no money for a return ticket, no family to wire for help, and night was approaching in a town where a woman alone faced dangers she'd rather not contemplate. Her fingers traced the rough edge of the telegram one last time before she let the wind take it, watching as her last link to Robert's false promises danced away across the sun-baked earth. The cowboy was still watching, his black Stetson pulled low against the setting sun. Sarah squared her shoulders, determined that whatever came next, she would face it with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through all the hard years before. She was, after all, her father's daughter, and Jonathan Mitchell hadn't raised a girl who would break, even when the whole world seemed determined to break her. The cowboy's boots made solid contact with each wooden plank as he crossed the platform, his spurs singing a quiet song of iron and earth. He moved with the easy grace of a man who spent more time in the saddle than on his feet, keeping a respectful distance as he approached. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat to reveal sun-bleached hair, peppered with grey at the temples. "James McKinnon. I own the Fallen Star Ranch, about 20 miles north." His voice was deep but gentle, like distant thunder without the threat of storm. Sarah nodded stiffly, her hands clasped tight around her carpet-bag. "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, years of proper Boston manners winning out over her wariness. "Miss Mitchell," he acknowledged, then gestured toward the station's small cafe. "Might I buy you a cup of coffee? You look like you could use something warm." She hesitated, studying him. His clothes were trail-worn, but well-maintained. No dandified Western wannabe like Robert had turned out to be. The Colt revolver on his hip had the worn grip of a working man's tool, not a showpiece. Most telling were his eyes, clear blue and direct, meeting her gaze without flinching or falling to her wedding dress with mocking pity. "I don't accept charity, Mr. McKinnon." A slight smile touched his weathered face. "No, ma'am, I don't expect you do. Consider it payment for your own time. I've got a business proposition might interest you." Sarah glanced at the darkening sky, then back at the empty platform. Pride was all well and good, but night was coming and she had nowhere to go. "Very well." The cafe was empty, save for a sleepy-eyed cook who brightened at McKinnon's entrance. "Evening, Mr. James. The usual? Coffee for two, Joe, and whatever's warm in the pot." They settled at a corner table, Sarah perching carefully to keep her dress from the dusty floor. The coffee came black and strong, with bowls of beef stew that sent steam curling into the cooling air. "Eat first," McKinnon said, breaking off a piece of cornbread. "Business can wait." Sarah wanted to resist, to maintain some dignity, but the smell of food reminded her she hadn't eaten since early morning. She took a small bite, then another, forcing herself to eat slowly despite her hunger. "I've been watching you since the morning stage," McKinnon said finally, pushing his empty bowl aside. "Seen enough would-be brides come and go through Tombstone to recognize the look. Man named Robert Caldwell, I'm guessing." Sarah's spoon clattered against her bowl. "You know him?" "Know of him. He's pulled this same trick 3 times in the last 2 years. Writes to Eastern ladies, promises them marriage and a fine ranch, takes their dowry money and disappears." McKinnon's voice held a quiet anger. "Sheriff can't do much. Technically ain't illegal to change your mind about marrying someone, but it ain't right." "No," Sarah said softly. "It isn't." Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup, anger warring with humiliation. She wasn't the first. Somehow that made it both better and worse. "My ranch needs a woman's touch," McKinnon said, his directness startling her. "I've got 12 hands, a cook who can't bake bread to save his life, and more work than hours in the day. I'm offering you a job, Miss Mitchell. Room, board, and fair wages. 3 months trial, see how it suits us both." Sarah stared at him, searching for the trap. "As what, exactly?" "Housekeeper. Nothing more." His eyes held hers steadily. "You'll have your own room with a lock on the door. My word as a McKinnon that you'll be treated with respect. If after 3 months you want to move on, I'll pay your way to wherever you want to go." "Why?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "Why me?" McKinnon was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly between calloused hands. "Because 20 years ago my sister found herself in a similar situation. No one helped her." He looked up, and Sarah saw old pain in his eyes. "She didn't survive her first winter on the streets of Denver. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to help another woman in trouble, I would." He stood, settling his hat back on his head. "Take your time deciding. I'll be loading supplies at Wilson's Mercantile for the next hour. After that I ride for home, with or without a housekeeper." Sarah watched him leave, his spurs marking time against the wooden floor. Through the window, she could see Tombstone's lights beginning to flicker on, like stars falling to earth. Somewhere in those streets, she knew other desperate women were making harder choices than the one before her. She looked down at her white dress, at the careful stitches she'd sewn with such hope. Then she reached for her mother's Bible, opening it to where her family's photograph lay, preserved between promises of salvation. "What would you do, Papa?" she whispered. But the frozen faces in the photograph held no answers. Only the memory of a strength she desperately needed to find within herself. The wagon creaked beneath Sarah as it wound its way through the desert, each rotation of its wheels carrying her further from everything she'd known. She sat straight-backed on the wooden seat beside McKinnon, her carpet bag clutched in her lap, and her wedding dress carefully folded in the wagon bed behind them. The moon had risen, painting the landscape in shades of silver and shadow. Saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels against the star-filled sky, their arms reaching up as if in prayer. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of sage and something wild she couldn't name. "Rattler!" McKinnon's voice cut through the quiet. The horses shied as he pulled them up short, and Sarah caught the sound, an angry buzz that raised the hair on her neck. McKinnon handed her the reins, then reached for his rifle. "Hold steady," he said, taking aim at something in the darkness. Ahead, the shot cracked across the empty land, echoing off distant rocks. "That'll do it. Best we walk the horses for a bit, make sure there aren't more." He climbed down, rifle in one hand, and offered her his other. Sarah hesitated only a moment before accepting his help. Her feet had barely touched the ground when the horses snorted in alarm. McKinnon's arm went around her waist, pulling her, back as another rattler slithered past where she would have stepped. "Easy now," he murmured, though whether to her or the horses she wasn't sure. The warmth of his arm lasted only seconds before he stepped away, ever proper. "Desert's got its own rules, Miss Mitchell. First one is, always watch where you step." They walked beside the wagon for a while, McKinnon leading the horses, while Sarah carried the lantern he'd lit. Her city boots were not made for the rough ground, but she refused to complain. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the soft clink of harness and the whisper of wind through brush. "Tell me about the ranch," she said finally, more to distract herself from her aching feet than anything else. "Started with 40 acres and 6 cattle, he replied, pride warming his voice. "Now it's 3,000 acres, 200 head of cattle, and some of the finest quarter horses in the territory. Built every fence post myself, along with the main house and barn, all alone. Had help, good men, most of them ex-soldiers like myself. After the war, some of us couldn't settle back into city life. Too many ghosts." He glanced at her. "The West offers a fresh start if you're willing to work for it." Sarah thought of the textile mill, of the endless rhythm of machines and the overseer's constant scrutiny. "I'm not afraid of work, Mr. McKinnon." "James," he said quietly, "out here, formality don't survive long against practical needs. You'll be James, and I'll be Sarah, else the hands'll never relax around you." A coyote's cry echoed across the desert, answered by others in the distance. Sarah suppressed a shiver, not entirely from fear. There was something thrilling about this wild land, so different from Boston's cramped streets and strict social rules. "We're almost home," James said, pointing to a faint glow on the horizon. "Ranch hands keep a light burning in the barn. Sort of a beacon for nights like this." As they drew closer, shapes emerged from the darkness. A sturdy 2-story house built of rough-hewn logs, a large barn with straight, proud lines, and various outbuildings scattered in between. A dog's bark carried across the night, followed by the sound of boots on wooden planks. "Mr. James?" a voice called out. "That you?" "It's me, Pete. Brought our new housekeeper. Get the horses settled, Wood." "You?" Sarah watched as a lanky young man materialized from the shadows, touching his hat respectfully in her direction before taking the horse's reins. More figures moved in the darkness, ranch hands curious about the new arrival, but maintaining a polite distance. James lifted her carpet bag from the wagon, then held out his hand to help her down. As her feet touched the packed earth of the ranch yard, Sarah felt something shift inside her. This wasn't how she'd imagined beginning her new life in the West, but standing there under the infinite blanket of stars, she felt a curious sense of rightness. "Welcome to Fallen Star Ranch," James said softly, and for the first time since. Reading Robert's telegram, Sarah felt the knot in her chest begin to loosen. Whatever tomorrow might bring, for tonight she had solid ground beneath her feet and a roof over her head. Sometimes she was learning. That was enough of a beginning. Dawn came early to Fallen Star Ranch. Painting the sky in strokes of pink and gold, Sarah woke to the unfamiliar sounds of ranch life, roosters crowing, horses nickering, and the low murmur of men's voices as the hands began their day. Her room, small but clean, faced east, and sunlight streamed through the simple calico curtains. On the rough-hewn dresser lay her one luxury, her mother's old cookbook, its pages stained and dog-eared from years of use. She'd hesitated to bring it, nearly sold it in Boston when money was tight, but now she was grateful for its familiar weight in her hands. The kitchen proved to be a challenge. Years of bachelor living had left their mark. Mismatched pots hung haphazardly, the stovetop was caked with grease, and the pantry was a jumble of half-empty flour sacks and mysterious dried goods. "Morning, miss," a gruff voice startled her. An older man with a drooping moustache stood in the doorway, wearing a flour-dusted apron. "Cookie's my name. Been feeding these boys for nigh on 5 years. "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, noting his defensive stance. "Mr. McKinnon hired me as housekeeper." Cookie's eyes narrowed. "Don't need no help in my kitchen." Sarah opened her mother's cookbook, letting it fall naturally to a well-worn page. "Can you make buttermilk biscuits?" "Bread's bread," he muttered, but his eyes strayed to the recipe. "My mother won blue ribbons at the county fair with these," Sarah said softly. "Would you like to learn?" A long moment passed before Cookie's weathered face cracked into a reluctant smile. "Might at that, miss, might at that." Together they worked in companionable silence, Sarah teaching by example rather than instruction. When the first batch of biscuits emerged golden and flaky from the oven, Cookie's eyes widened. "Lord above," he whispered, breaking one open. Steam rose with the sweet smell of success. The ranch hands drifted in at the scent, trying to hide their curiosity behind mumbled greetings. Sarah saw their surprise as they tasted the biscuits, saw the appreciative glances thrown her way. Even James, coming in last with trail dust on his boots, paused mid-bite. "These are something special, Sarah," he said quietly. She felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the cooking stove. "My mother's recipe." After breakfast, Sarah tackled the house with the same determination that had once kept her going through 14-hour days at the mill. She found sheets in need of mending, rugs that hadn't seen a beating in years, and enough dust to plant a garden. But she also found signs of care. James's books were neatly arranged, his father's old rifle was well-oiled, and fresh flowers sat in a jar by the window. In the afternoon, James found her on the back porch, taking advantage of the good light. "To mend sheets." He leaned against the railing, his hat pushed back on his head. "Cookie says you've got a magic touch with bread," he said. "Haven't seen him this excited since we got the new stove." Sarah smiled, not looking up from her stitching. "He's a good man. Just needed someone to appreciate his efforts. Like most of us out here," James said softly. Then, clearing his throat, "The hands are breaking a new horse this evening. Would you like to watch? Might help you understand more about ranch life." She looked up then, catching something in his voice. He was offering more than just a chance to watch horse breaking. He was offering to include her in the ranch's daily life, to make her more than just a housekeeper. "I'd like that," she said. The sun was setting when James came to fetch her, casting long shadows across the yard. The hands had gathered around the corral, their usual banter subdued as they watched a young bay stallion circle nervously. That spirit James explained, leading her to a safe spot by the fence. Been working with him for weeks. Got a lot. A fire in him, but a gentle heart underneath. Sarah watched the horse, seeing the fear beneath its defiance. Sometimes, she said quietly, the gentlest hearts fight the hardest when they're scared. James looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared understanding. But before either could speak, the horse-breaking began, and Sarah found herself drawn into the ancient dance between man and horse, civilization and wilderness, fear and trust. A grip with your knees, not your hands, James called out, watching as Sarah adjusted her seat on the old mare he'd chosen for her first riding lesson. The reins are for guidance, not holding on. The morning sun was barely over the mountains, but already the air held the promise of desert heat. Sarah wore one of her few remaining dresses, the skirt hitched up awkwardly to accommodate the saddle. She'd refused to ride side saddle. If I'm to learn, I'll learn properly, she'd insisted. 2 weeks had passed since her arrival at Fallen Star Ranch, and the changes were visible in more than just the gleaming kitchen and fresh-swept floors. There was color in her cheeks now, and her hands, though still bearing the calluses of millwork, were developing new ones from ranch life. That's better. James nodded as she found her balance. Now we'll walk the fence line. Best way to learn the property is to see it up close. They rode at an easy pace, James pointing out landmarks and boundaries marked by weather-worn fence posts. Sarah found herself memorizing not just the markers, but the way the land itself flowed, how arroyos cut through the terrain, where springs bubbled up from hidden depths, which slopes offered the best grazing. Watch how the grass changes, James said, indicating the subtle shifts in color and texture. That's how you know where the good water lies underground. Cattle know it instinctively, but ranchers have to learn. A jackrabbit burst from behind a creosote bush, startling Sarah's mare. She held firm, remembering James's instructions about keeping calm, and the horse settled quickly. Well handled, James said, approval warming his voice. You're a natural. Hardly, Sarah laughed, but pride flickered in her chest. Though it's not so different from working a sewing machine, you have to feel the rhythm of it, work with it, rather than against it. They paused at a high point overlooking the ranch. From here, Sarah could see the whole spread of Fallen Star, the main house and barn-like toys in the distance, cattle dots scattered across the grassland, and the glint of the creek that gave life to it all. My father used to say that every fence post tells a story, James said, dismounting to check a loose wire. This one here, put it in during the drought of '65. Ground was hard as iron. Took all day to dig one hole. Sarah watched him work, his hands sure and capable on the wire. You love this land, she said softly. It wasn't a question. It's in my blood now. He looked up at her, squinting against the sun. You can't work a piece of earth this long without it becoming part of you, or you becoming part of it. A crow called overhead, drawing their attention to a group of riders approaching from the north. James shaded his eyes, then smiled. That'll be Pete and the boys, bringing in strays. Want to see how it's done? Sarah nodded eagerly, and they rode to meet the hands. Pete tipped his hat to her, no longer awkward around the city lady since she'd proved herself with fresh bread and mended shirts. Got us some visitors, Mr. James, Pete reported. Thompson's cattle mixed with ours again. They're running 2 drainages over. James's face tightened. Thompson knows better. 3rd time this month. Want us to push them back? No, I'll handle Thompson. James turned to Sarah. Care to see how we sort cattle? For the next hour, Sarah watched in fascination as the hands demonstrated the art of cutting specific cattle from the herd. It was like a dance, she thought, horses and riders moving as one, anticipating each other's moves, reading subtle signals. Want to try? James asked, seeing her interest. Sarah looked at the milling cattle, then at her borrowed dress. I'm not exactly dressed for it. Life rarely waits for proper dress, he smiled. Besides, that old mare of yours has more cow sense than most cowboys. She'll do the work. You just need to trust her. Trust. Such a simple word for such a difficult thing. But Sarah found herself nodding, gathering her reins as James had shown her. The mare's ears pricked forward, sensing a change in purpose. Just walk her in easy, James instructed, riding beside her. Watch how she reads the cattle. When she turns, turn with her. Don't fight her instincts. To Sarah's amazement, the mare seemed to know exactly what to do. They moved through the herd with careful precision, and she felt the moment when horse and rider found their rhythm together. It was like threading a needle, she realized, knowing exactly where you needed to go and trusting your hands to take. You there? When they finally broke from the herd, success thrumming through her veins, Sarah caught James watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Pride was there, yes, but something else too, something that made the vast desert seem suddenly small and intimate. You're full of surprises, Sarah Mitchell, he said quietly. The bundle of letters lay on Sarah's bed like a snake coiled to strike. They'd arrived that morning with Pete, who'd collected them from the sheriff in town. 7 letters total, each from a different woman, each telling the same story of Robert Caldwell and his promises of love and land. Sarah's hands trembled as she untied the faded ribbon holding them together. The first was dated 2 years ago, written in a neat schoolteacher's hand from Ohio. The second came from a seamstress in Pennsylvania. One by one she read their stories. Tales of lengthy correspondences, money sent west for ranch improvements, train tickets that led to empty stations or cruel telegrams. A knock at her door startled her. "Sarah?" James's voice was gentle. "Sheriff sent word about the letters. Thought you might want company while reading them." She wiped her eyes, surprised to find tears there. "Come in." James entered, carrying a pot of coffee and 2 cups. He set them on her small table, then settled into the room's single chair, giving her space but offering silent support. "He used the same words," Sarah said finally, holding up one letter. "The exact same phrases about building something lasting together. I thought they were just for me." "Men like Caldwell have a pattern," James replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "They prey on decent women's dreams, turn hope into a weapon." Sarah picked up another letter, recognizing the desperate hurt in its lines. What happened to them? The other women? Some went home if they had homes to return to. Some found honest work in town. A few... He trailed off, and Sarah thought of his sister in Denver. "I was lucky," she said softly. "You found me first." James poured coffee, buying time before responding. "Way I see it, luck had little to do with it. You're still standing because you're strong, Sarah, stronger than Caldwell knew." She looked down at Robert's letters, her own carefully preserved pack of lies. Without a word, she stood and walked to the fireplace. One by one, she fed the letters to the flames, watching as his false promises turned to ash. "The sheriff," James said, watching her, "says Caldwell was spotted in Prescott last week. He's already trying his scheme again." Sarah turned, something hardening in her chest. Can nothing be done? Law's complicated out here, but word spreads. Every station master from here to California now knows his name and method. He'll find it harder to operate. A thought struck her. "The other women, their letters warning others, that's what saved me, isn't it? That's how you knew to watch for him at the station." James nodded. "Women looking out for women. Sometimes that's the strongest law there is." Sarah touched the rough paper of the last letter, not yet burned. "Then I should write one too. Add my voice to theirs. Perhaps," she paused, finding strength in the idea, "perhaps the next woman will read it before she sells everything too." Chase his promises. James stood, and for a moment Sarah thought he might reach for her. Instead, he moved to the window, looking out over the land they both were coming to love. "You're not her anymore," he said quietly. "That woman waiting at the station with nothing but broken promises. You're building something real now." Sarah joined him at the window. The setting sun painted the desert in shades of rose and gold, turning mundane ranch work into something beautiful. She watched Cookie ring the dinner bell, saw Pete leading, Horses to the corral noticed how the newly mended fence gleamed in the fading light. Yes, she said, more to herself than James. Something real. She could feel him beside her, solid and present as the land itself. When his hand found hers, rough with work and warm with life, she didn't pull away. They stood together, watching. Their world settled into evening, while behind them, the last of Robert's letters burned to ash, taking with it the last chains of what might have been. The storm came without warning, the way weather often did in the desert. One moment Sarah was gathering eggs from the henhouse, her mother's silver locket catching the morning light, and the next she was watching a wall of dust roll across the plains like God's own curtain. "Sarah!" James's voice cut through the rising wind. "Get to the storm cellar!" She clutched her basket of eggs, hesitating. "The horses! Pete's handling them, go!" But Sarah had already seen what James hadn't. Spirit, the half-broken stallion, had panicked at the approaching storm and broken free of his corral. The horse was running straight for the barbed wire fence. Without thinking, Sarah dropped her basket and ran. Behind her she heard James curse, then the thunder of hoofbeats as he galloped after her. The wind whipped her skirts, throwing stinging sand against her face. Her mother's locket bounced against her chest with each stride. Spirit reached the fence, reared up in terror. Sarah's voice somehow carried through the howling wind. "Easy, boy. Easy now." The stallion hesitated, recognizing her voice from weeks of gentle words, and offered apples. Those precious seconds were all James needed. He rode up alongside Spirit, reached out and caught the trailing lead rope. "Sarah, the cellar now!" This time she ran, James following with Spirit in tow. They barely made it. The storm hit full force, just as James pulled the cellar doors shut behind them, plunging them into darkness, broken only by the lantern that always hung ready. In its dim light, Sarah could see Spirit trembling, still spooked, but contained in the cramped space. James looped his rope around a support beam, then turned to her. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice rough with what might have been fear or anger. Sarah's hands shook. As the danger of what she'd done hit her, "I couldn't let him die on that fence." "No," James said softly. "You couldn't. That's what worries me." Above them the storm raged. Sand hissed against the cellar doors like 1,000 angry rattlers. Spirit gradually calmed under their quiet voices and gentle hands until he stood dozing despite the thunder of wind. Sarah touched her mother's locket, a nervous habit. The silver was warm from her skin, a reminder of all she'd carried with her from Boston. "I used to be afraid of storms," she said, not sure why she was sharing this. "In the mill, when the machines were running and thunder shook the windows, I'd hold this locket and pretend I could feel my mother's strength." James moved closer, just enough to see the locket in the lantern light. "May I?" She nodded, slipping the chain over her head. James handled it carefully, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle as he opened the catch. Inside were 2 tiny photographs, her parents on their wedding day. "You have her smile," he said. "Same kind of strength in it." Sarah looked up, startled by his closeness. In the lantern's glow, his eyes held shadows she'd never seen before. "I've watched you these past weeks," he said quietly. "Seen how you face each challenge head-on, how you've made this place better just by being in it. You remind me of this land, beautiful but strong enough to weather any storm." Her heart thundered louder than the wind above. "James, No, it's too soon," he continued. "You came here for safety, not—" He stopped, struggling with words that seemed to catch in his throat. Sarah reached for the locket, her fingers brushing his. Neither pulled away. "When I first arrived," she said carefully, "I thought I was broken, that Robert had taken something from me I couldn't get back. And now? Now I know he didn't take anything. He just showed me what I already had inside. Strength. Courage." She paused, her voice softening. "The ability to trust again, when trust is earned." James's hand closed over hers, warm and calloused and real. They stood that way as the storm raged overhead, the lantern casting their shadows large against the cellar walls. Between them, Spirit dozed peacefully. no longer afraid of the thunder. When James finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Storms pass, Sarah. It's what's left standing afterward that matters." She looked at their joined hands, at the locket that had carried her parents' love through all the hard years. "Yes," she said simply, "it is." The church bulletin board told stories more honest than any sermon. Sarah stood before it in the dusty Sunday morning light, reading between the lines of posted notices and social announcements. Her name wasn't mentioned, but she felt it in the sideways glances of the townsfolk gathering for services. "Don't let them bother you," James murmured, standing closer than strictly proper. His Sunday best sat uncomfortably on his shoulders, but he'd insisted on accompanying her to church. Small towns run on gossip like engines run on steam. The whispers had started after the storm. Pete had seen them emerge from the cellar, James's hand at Sarah's elbow, spirit following docile as a lamb. By sunset, the story had grown wings and flown to town on the supply wagon. Mrs. Thompson, the banker's wife, rustled past in silk skirts that had no business in desert dust. "My dear," she said, her smile sharp as a cactus thorn, "I don't believe we've been properly introduced, though I've heard so much about you." Sarah met her eyes steadily. "Sarah Mitchell. I keep house at Fallen Star Ranch." "Is that what they're calling it these days?" The words were soft, meant to wound. James stepped forward, but Sarah's hand on his arm stopped him. "Yes, ma'am," she replied clearly, "along with baking, mending, and teaching your husband's cowboys how to make decent biscuits when they're on the drive." Several nearby ranchers' wives poorly disguised their laughter as coughing. Mrs. Thompson's face pinched, then smoothed into careful blankness. She moved away without another word. Inside the small wooden church, Sarah felt the weight of stairs. The preacher's words about judgment and redemption seemed pointed, though whether at her or the congregation, she couldn't tell. A small hand tugged her skirt. Lucy Chen, daughter of the Chinese merchant who'd helped James through the drought, of 65, offered a shy smile and a slightly crushed wildflower. Sarah tucked it into her Bible, ignoring the disapproving sniffs from the next pew. After the service, James led her toward the wagon, but Sarah paused. "I need to do this," she said quietly. "Go ahead to the mercantile. I'll join you." He studied. Her face then nodded. Sarah turned and walked directly to where the town's women gathered, their Sunday conversations a carefully maintained barrier. "Ladies," she said clearly, "I believe we should understand each other. I came to Fallen Star Ranch with nothing but a broken promise and my own 2 hands. What I've built there, my reputation, my place, I've earned through honest work. You can whisper all you like, but you can't make me ashamed of who I am or what I do." Silence fell like a heavy blanket. Then Martha Reed, whose son Sarah had nursed through fever last month, stepped forward. "My boy still talks about your chicken soup," she said. "Would you share the recipe?" The barrier cracked. Other women stepped forward. Mary Wilson needed help with a torn quilt. Jessica Cooper wanted biscuit-making lessons for her daughter's upcoming wedding. Not all, but enough. Sarah found James waiting by the wagon, watching with quiet pride. "Went well?" he asked, helping her up to the seat. "Well enough." She settled her skirts, chin high. "Though Mrs. Thompson might need smelling salts." James laughed, the sound carrying across the street. Sarah saw heads turn, saw the speculative glances, and found she no longer cared. Let them talk. She knew who she was now. Not Robert's discarded bride or James's charity case, but a woman who had found her own strength in the unforgiving desert sun. As they drove home, the late morning heat shimmering around them, Sarah remembered Lucy's flower, pressed between Bible pages like a promise. Sometimes, she thought, the smallest gestures of kindness meant more than any grand declaration. "You're quiet," James observed, his shoulder warm against hers on the wagon seat. Sarah smiled, watching Fallen Star Ranch appear on the horizon like a welcome harbor. "Just thinking about home," she said, and meant it. Dawn hadn't yet touched the horizon when Sarah joined the men at the corral. She wore split skirts she'd sewn herself, drawing raised eyebrows from the hands but a quiet nod of approval from James. The cattle brand hung ready at the fire pit. The fallen star mark that would soon mark each calf as belonging to the ranch. "You don't have to do this," James said softly as she mounted her horse. No longer the gentle mare, but a cow pony she'd trained with over the past weeks. "Cookie can manage." "Cookie can't tell a cow from a cactus," the old cook grumbled good-naturedly, loading the chuck wagon. "Besides, someone's got to keep you lot fed properly." Sarah gathered her reins. "I'm coming. These cattle are as much my responsibility as anyone's now." Pete rode up, leading spirit. The stallion had become Sarah's project, gentled through, patience and understanding rather than force. Now he served as James's primary mount, a living testament to her place on the ranch. The cattle drive to the railhead would take 5 days if the weather held. 200 head of cattle moved like a slow-rolling river across the desert grassland, guided by skilled riders and faithful dogs. Sarah found her place naturally, working alongside men who no longer saw her as an outsider, but as a valued part of their team. By midday, dust coated everything, clothes, skin, even the food when they stopped for a quick meal. Sarah's arms ached from hours of keeping cattle from straying, but pride burned brighter than fatigue. She'd held her own, earned her place. "Got yourself a natural there, Mr. James," old Tom said during the noon break, his leathery face creased in a rare smile. "Ain't many women would take to this life like she has." James watched as Sarah helped Pete with a stubborn calf. "No," he agreed softly, "there aren't." The afternoon brought challenges. A rattler spooked part of the herd, threatening to start a stampede. Sarah found herself in the thick of it, her horse responding to the lightest touch as they turned the frightened cattle. She caught glimpses of James nearby, their movements synchronized as if they'd worked together for years instead of months. When the dust settled, no cattle were lost. James rode close, his face tight with what might have been fear or pride. "That was well done," he said, voice rough. "Thought my heart would stop when I saw you ride in." "Had to be done," Sarah replied, but warmth bloomed in her chest at his words. They made camp as the sun set, the chuck wagon becoming the center of their temporary world. Sarah worked alongside Cookie, turning trail provisions into something that reminded the men of home. The brand she'd watched heat that morning had marked dozens of calves, each one adding to the ranch's future. After supper, when the night wrapped around them like a blanket and the cattle settled under starlight, Sarah sat by the fire writing in her journal. She'd started it the day she arrived at Fallen Star, tracking her transformation from city seamstress to rancher. James settled beside her, offering coffee. "Penny for your thoughts?" "Just remembering the girl who stepped off that train," she said, accepting the cup. "Seems like a lifetime ago." "Having regrets?" Sarah looked up at the vast, star-scattered sky, then around at the sleeping cattle, the cowboys on night watch, the comfortable routine they'd built. "No," she said truthfully. "No regrets." They sat in comfortable silence until Pete rode up for his coffee. "Begging pardon, Mr. James, but we've got Thompson cattle mixing with ours again. At least 30 head from the look of it." James's jaw tightened. "Third time this month. This isn't accident anymore. Want us to cut them out now?" "No." James stood, his decision made. "First light, Sarah, you'll help lead the cut. You've got the best eye for our marks." It was more than a practical choice. It was a declaration of trust, of her place in the ranch's operations. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle comfortably on her shoulders. Later, wrapped in her bedroll near the chuck wagon, Sarah listened to the night sounds of the desert. A coyote called in the distance, answered by the drowsy lowing of cattle. Somewhere out there, James rode night watch, guarding all they'd built together. Her hand found her mother's locket, but now, instead of seeking comfort from the past, she found herself looking toward the future. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but she was ready. She belonged here now, as surely as if she'd been born to it, not because of any man's choice, but because she'd chosen it for herself. The last days of summer painted the desert in shades of gold and purple, evening light catching on the dried wildflowers Sarah had pressed between the pages of her Bible. 3 months had passed like water through her fingers, and now time was running out on her agreement with James. She stood at the kitchen window, watching him work with spirit in the corral. The stallion had come so far under their shared care, no longer the frightened creature who'd nearly died. In a storm, like her, he'd found his place at Fallen Star Ranch. "Miss Sarah?" Cookie's voice broke into her thoughts. "Biscuits are burning." She rescued them from the oven, annoyed at her distraction. Lately, it seemed harder to focus on simple tasks, her mind constantly wandering to the approaching deadline neither she nor James had mentioned. "Something's troubling you," Cookie said, not really a question. He'd become more friend than colleague. Over the months, his gruff exterior hiding a gentle heart. "Just thinking about changes," she replied, sorting the salvageable biscuits from the burnt ones. "Heard tell Mr. James is riding into town tomorrow. Getting your train ticket, maybe?" Sarah's hands stilled. "He hasn't mentioned it. Man's got his pride." Cookie busied himself with the stew pot. "Sometimes pride makes a fool of the wisest heart." Outside, James had finished with spirit. He stood at the corral fence, staring toward the mountains as if they held answers to unasked questions. Sarah watched him run a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as frustration. The dinner bell rang too soon, bringing the hands in from their work. Sarah served mechanically, aware of James at the head of the table, of the careful distance they'd maintained these past few days. The easy companionship of the cattle drive had faded into something more uncertain. After the men left for the bunkhouse, Sarah walked out to check the garden she'd started months ago. The desert soil had proved surprisingly fertile once worked properly, offering up tomatoes and squash that supplemented their meals. She'd been planning to put in winter crops, she realized, making plans for a future she might not be part of. "Sarah!" She turned to find James behind her, holding something in his hands. In the fading light, she recognized the pressed wildflower she'd tucked away so many weeks ago. "Found this," he said roughly. "Fell from your Bible when Pete borrowed it for Sunday readings." "The one Lucy gave me," Sarah said softly. "My first Sunday in town." James turned the dried flower carefully, its purple petals still vivid against his calloused palm. "Seems a lifetime ago." "James, I'm riding to—" "In town tomorrow," he cut in. "Need to arrange things." Her heart stuttered. "My ticket." His eyes met hers, then dropped back to the flower. "If that's what you want." "Is it what you want?" The question hung between them like smoke on a still day. James stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could see the war of emotions on his face. "What I want," he said finally, "is what's best for you. You came here needing shelter, not what? Not a man who's more ranch than refinement. Not someone who can't offer you the kind of life you deserved, the kind Robert promised." Sarah felt anger flare, hot and unexpected. "Robert promised lies. You've given me truth, given me a home, work that matters, people who've become family." 3 months. James's voice was rough. "That was our agreement. Agreements can change." "Sarah, no." She took the flower from his hands, letting her fingers brush his. "You're right. I came here needing shelter, but I stayed because I found something I never knew I was looking for. Something real." The sun had set fully now, painting the sky in deep blues and purples. From the bunkhouse came the sound of Pete's harmonica, playing a slow, sweet tune that drifted across the yard like a living thing. James stood very still, hope and fear warring in his expression. "I can't offer you an easy life." "I don't want easy," Sarah said softly. "I want this. The ranch, the work, the family we've built here." She paused, gathering her courage. "You." He reached for her then, his hand cupping her cheek with infinite gentleness. The pressed flower fell forgotten as Sarah leaned into his touch, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and careful strength. "Stay," he whispered, the word carrying all the weight of a proposal. "Not as my housekeeper, as my—" A shout. From the bunkhouse shattered the moment. Riders coming. Mr. James, riders coming fast. The riders emerged from the darkness like ghosts. 3 men on lathered horses, their approach scattering dust and tension across the ranch yard. James stepped in front of Sarah, his hand dropping instinctively to his gun belt. "Well, well," called a cultured voice that stopped Sarah's heart. "Quite the cozy scene I've interrupted." Robert Caldwell sat his horse like a man playing at being a rancher, his clothes too clean for real trail work. A silver-handled revolver gleamed at his hip, matched by the dangerous smiles of his companions. "You're not welcome here, Caldwell," James said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now is that any way to greet a man coming to claim his bride?" Robert's eyes found Sarah. "My dear, you've been quite difficult to track down. Imagine my surprise when I heard tales of a jilted woman making herself at home at Fallen Star Ranch." Sarah stepped forward, ignoring James's attempt to keep her back. "I'm not your bride, Robert. I never really was. Now, Sarah, don't be hasty. I admit there was a misunderstanding at the station, but I've come to make it right." He reached into his jacket, producing a folded bank draft. "Your dowry money. Returned with interest, plus enough for a fine wedding in San Francisco." The paper fluttered in the evening breeze, and Sarah saw what James had already noticed, the telltale signs of a forgery, the same kind mentioned in the other women's letters. "Mighty generous," James said, his tone suggesting anything but, especially for a man who's been running the same confidence game across 3 territories. Robert's pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold beneath. "This doesn't concern you, McKinnon. The lady and I have a prior arrangement. The lady," Sarah said clearly, "has already found her home." One of Robert's companions laughed, an ugly sound. "Boss, you didn't say she'd turned ranch woman. Maybe we should just take the cattle and leave her to play cowgirl." James's gun cleared its holster faster than Sarah could blink. "That sounded like a threat, friend." "Just business," Robert said smoothly. "You see, I've recently acquired an interest in the Thompson spread. Seems your cattle have been mixing with his rather frequently. Could lead to ownership disputes." Understanding dawned. "You've been pushing Thompson's cattle onto our land deliberately," Sarah accused. "Setting up a fake claim." "Smart girl." Robert's smile turned predatory, though I prefer to think of it as creative redistribution. "Of course, if you were to come with me now, Sarah, perhaps we could resolve these unfortunate business matters amicably." Pete and the other hands had emerged from the bunkhouse, rifles ready but waiting for James's signal. Even Cookie stood in the kitchen doorway, his shotgun gleaming dully in the lamplight. Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. This man had once held her dreams in his letters, had nearly broken her with his betrayal. Now, looking at his false smile and fancy clothes, she wondered how she'd ever believed his promises. "I believed in you once," she said, her voice carrying in the tense silence. "Believed in the man who wrote those beautiful letters about building something lasting. But everything about you is a lie, isn't it, Robert?" "Now, darling, don't call me that." Sarah moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with James. "I've learned what real men are like, men who work the land with their own hands, who keep their word even when it costs them, who build something true instead of living on lies." "Pretty speech," Robert sneered, his cultured accent slipping. "But words won't stop bullets. Thompson's already signed over his claim to me. One way or another, Fallen Star Ranch will be mine." "That's where you're wrong." The new voice came from the darkness behind Robert. Sheriff Davis rode into the light, followed by Thompson himself and 4 deputies. "Got enough witnesses now to prove your land fraud scheme, Caldwell. Plus, sworn statements from 3 other women you swindled." Robert's hand moved for his gun, but James was faster. "Don't," he said softly. "Some fights aren't worth dying for." For a moment, the night balanced on a knife's edge. Then Robert raised his hands, his confident mask cracking completely. "This isn't over." "Yes," Sarah said firmly, "it is." They watched as the sheriff and his men took Robert and his companions into custody. Thompson looked ashamed as he approached James. McKinnon, he had papers. Said he'd save my ranch from the bank if I helped him claim yours. I was a fool. We'll talk tomorrow, James said, not unkindly. Neighbor to neighbor. As the dust settled and the hands returned to the bunkhouse, Sarah felt James's arm slip around her waist. She leaned into him, feeling the solid strength that had nothing to do with guns or threats. Quite a speech about real men, he said softly. Sarah smiled, watching her past ride away in handcuffs. Every word true. Dawn found Sarah on the front porch of Fallen Star Ranch, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of promise. The ranch's deed lay in her lap, James's most closely guarded possession, proof of everything he'd built with his own hands. He'd left it on her pillow sometime in the night, his intentions clear in the simple gesture. Inside, she could hear Cookie beginning his morning routine, the familiar clatter of pots and pans, a comfort after the previous night's chaos. The ranch was coming awake slowly, as if the land itself needed time to recover from Robert's disruption. Thought I'd find you here? James stood in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in his weathered hands. He'd clearly been up for hours, his boots already dusty from morning chores. Sarah accepted the offered cup, breathing in the rich aroma that had become part of her daily ritual. You left me something, she said softly, touching the deed. Seemed right. He settled beside her on the porch step, close enough that their shoulders touched. Been thinking about what you said last night, about real men and building something true. James! Let me finish. He stared out at the lightening horizon, gathering his thoughts. When you first came here, I told myself I was just offering shelter to a woman in need, doing what any decent man would do. But that wasn't the whole truth. Sarah's heart quickened, but she remained silent, letting him find his way through the words. I saw something in you that day at the station, a strength that matched this land, beautiful but unbending. Everything you've done since then has only proved me right. He turned to face her fully. This ranch, it's not just land and cattle. It's a dream I've built piece by piece. Never thought I'd want to share it with anyone until you came along. Are you asking me to stay on as your housekeeper? Sarah's voice held a hint of teasing, though her eyes were serious. No. James took the deed from her lap, then reached for her hand. I'm asking you to be my partner, in all things. To build something lasting together, not based on fancy words in letters, but on honest work and true feelings. Sarah looked down at their joined hands, his calloused from rope and reins, hers marked by needle and garden soil. Different kinds of work that had somehow woven together into a shared life. The deed should have both our names, he finished, if you'll have me, and the ranch, and this hard but beautiful life. Sarah stood, drawing him up with her. The rising sun caught her mother's locket, making it shine like a blessing. You know, when I first came west, I thought I was chasing a dream of marriage, of belonging somewhere. Never imagined I'd find both in a place so different from what I'd planned. That a yes? James's voice was rough with emotion. Instead of answering directly, Sarah reached up and touched his cheek, feeling the morning stubble beneath her fingers. You remember that first morning you taught me to ride? You said I had to trust the horse, trust myself. He nodded, covering her hand with his own. I learned more than riding that day, she continued. Learned that real trust, real love, grows from actions, not words. You've shown me who you are every day since I arrived, in how you treat your animals, your hands, this land, she smiled, even in how you let me find my own way here. Sarah Mitchell, James said softly, you're talking around my question. James McKinnon, she matched his tone. I'm saying yes. Yes to being your partner, your wife, your match in all things. Yes to building something lasting together. He pulled her close then, his kiss tasting of coffee and promise and dessert morning. When they finally parted, Sarah saw Pete and the other hands quickly pretending they hadn't been watching from the bunkhouse porch. Well, Cookie's voice called, from the kitchen window. About time. Now maybe we can have a proper celebration breakfast. James laughed, the sound carrying across the ranch yard. "What do you say, partner? Ready to start our first day proper?" Sarah looked out at the land that had become her home, at the people who had become her family. The sun had fully risen now, turning Fallen Star Ranch into a painting of light and shadow and endless possibility. "Lead the way," she said, and meant it with all her heart. News of the engagement spread through Tombstone like wildfire in dry grass. Sarah stood in Martha Reed's parlor, surrounded by the same women who had once whispered behind their hands at church. Now they clustered around a quilting frame there, needles flying as they worked on her wedding gift. "Every bride needs a proper quilt," Martha declared, guiding Sarah's hands as she added her own stitches to the pattern. "And this one tells a story." Indeed it did. Each square held meaning: a horse pattern for Spirit's rescue, desert flowers for the garden Sarah had coaxed from dusty soil, interlocked rings for the journey ahead. Even Mrs. Thompson had contributed, her precise stitches forming a delicate morning star that seemed to glow against the fabric. "Never thought I'd see James McKinnon caught," Jessica Cooper mused, threading her needle. "Man's been married to that ranch since he came back from the war." Until the right woman got off. "The wrong train," Mary Wilson smiled. "Sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways." Sarah touched the quilt square she'd just finished. A simple heart formed of feed sack cotton, like her first wedding dress had been. "I came here thinking I knew what I wanted. Turns out I needed something I didn't even know to look for." "Love's like that," Martha nodded. "Finds you when you're busy making other plans." The afternoon light slanted through lace curtains as the women worked and talked. Sarah learned more about James in those hours than she had in months at the ranch. Stories of his kindness during hard times, of quiet help given to struggling neighbors, of a man who lived by a code as straight as fence wire. He helped Tom keep our place during the drought, Martha said softly. Never asked for payment, just said neighbors look after neighbors. In town, James was handling preparations of his own. Pete had ridden in with news that the men were rebuilding the ranches on Chapel, unused since James's parents had passed, but still standing sturdy against the desert wind. "Whole crew's working on it," Pete reported. "Cookie's even whitewashing the walls, though he claims it's just to keep the dust down." The days seemed to fly past. Lucy Chen and her mother arrived with silk ribbons for Sarah's hair, declaring that every bride needed something fine to offset the practical. The ranch hands, not to be outdone, presented her with a beautifully tooled saddle of her own. The leather worked with mountains and stars. One evening, Sarah found James in the chapel, measuring boards for new pews. She watched him work for a moment, loving the sure way his hands moved over wood. "The whole town's involved now," she said, settling on a stack of lumber. Martha Reed's quilting circle, the Cooper girls making bunting, even Mrs. Thompson offered her silver service. For the reception, James smiled, driving a nail home. "Same folks who weren't sure about you 3 months ago. People change." Sarah picked up a hammer, falling naturally into working beside him. "When they see truth clearly enough." "Speaking of truth," James paused, wiping sawdust from his hands. "Got something for you." From his pocket he drew a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside, Sarah found a silver band set with a small, perfect diamond. "It was my mother's," James said quietly. "She made me promise I'd only give it to someone who loved the land as much as she did. Someone who understood that beauty out here comes with calluses and grit." Sarah slipped the ring onto her finger, where it settled as naturally as if it had always belonged there. The diamond caught the light from the chapel's new windows, throwing tiny rainbows across the fresh-hewn pews. "Perfect fit," she whispered. "Like you," James said simply, and pulled her close. Later, walking back to the main house hand in hand, they paused to watch the sunset paint the desert in wedding colors, rose and gold and deepest purple. From the bunkhouse came the sound of Pete's harmonica playing an old love song, while Cookie's voice raised in cheerful argument about the proper spices for wedding cake. Sarah squeezed James's hand, feeling the quiet joy that came with absolute certainty. She was no longer the lost bride from the station platform. She was home. The threatening letter arrived 3 days before the wedding, carried by a nervous boy from the telegraph office. Sarah found it tucked beneath her mother's locket, where she'd left it on her dresser, Robert's elegant handwriting a stark contrast to his crude message. A woman who betrays her promises deserves to lose everything. Tell McKinnon to watch his precious ranch burn. Sarah's hands didn't shake as she read it. That surprised her. The old Sarah might have trembled, might have given in to fear. Instead, she felt a cold anger settle in her chest. "Ma'am?" Pete's voice carried from outside. "You might want to see this." She stepped onto the porch and felt her heart stop. Smoke rose from 3 points on the horizon: the north pasture, the east fence line, and worst of all, the drought-dry grass near the chapel. Robert hadn't just made threats. He'd escaped custody and made good on them. "James," she called, already moving toward the stable. "Rode out at dawn to check the high pasture," Pete answered, mounting up. "Cookie's ringing the alarm bell. Town'll send help when they see the smoke." Sarah's mind raced as she saddled her horse. "The chapel, Tom and the boys are heading there now. But Miss Sarah, there's something else. Spirit's gone from his corral, and there's signs of someone leading him out. Tracks head toward Devil's Canyon." Of course. Robert would know what the stallion meant to them, would understand how his loss would cut deeper than any fire. Sarah's jaw tightened as she swung into the saddle. "Miss Sarah," Pete started, "Mr. James wouldn't want—" "James isn't here," she cut him off, "and I know that canyon better than Robert ever could. Get the men on those fires. I'll handle Spirit." She rode hard, her mother's locket bouncing against her chest like a second heartbeat. Devil's Canyon was treacherous, a maze of narrow trails and sudden drops that had claimed more than one careless rider. But Sarah had ridden every inch of it with James, learning the ranch's boundaries, understanding its dangers. The track was clear enough. Robert wasn't even trying to hide his path. He wanted to be followed, wanted to draw them into a trap. But Sarah had learned from James that the shortest path wasn't always the wisest. She guided her horse up a steep trail that paralleled the main canyon. From here she could see Robert below, leading Spirit toward the box canyon they used for breaking stubborn horses. The stallion fought the unfamiliar hand, but Robert kept him under control with brutal jerks of the lead rope. Sarah's blood boiled at the sight, but she forced herself to stay calm. James's voice seemed to whisper in her memory. "Patient hands make willing horses. Same goes for most problems in life." She waited until Robert had entered the box canyon, then moved into position at its mouth. Only then did she draw the rifle from her saddle scabbard, the one James had insisted she learn to use, because sometimes trouble doesn't wait for men to handle it. "That's far enough, Robert." He spun, jerking Spirit's rope so hard the horse reared. Well, the little seamstress learned to play cowgirl after all. "Let him go." Robert's laugh was ugly. "Or what? You'll shoot me. We both know you don't have it in you, Sarah. You're still that soft city girl inside, dreaming of romantic letters and happy endings." "You're wrong." Sarah's voice was steady as the rifle in her hands. "I'm not that girl anymore. I'm a rancher's wife, and you're threatening my home." "Not yet a wife," he sneered. "Not if the chapel burns. Not if your precious James finds his prize stallion with a broken leg at the bottom of this canyon. And that for a wedding present." He raised his arm to strike Spirit with his quirt, but the horse was faster. Months of gentle handling had taught Spirit to trust humans, but also to recognize threats. He reared again, pulling the rope from Robert's grip, then bolted, straight toward Sarah, who he knew as friend. Robert drew his gun, aiming not at Sarah, but at the fleeing horse. Her rifle cracked once, the sound echoing off canyon walls. Robert's gun flew from his hand, spinning away into the dust. "Next one won't hit your gun," Sarah said calmly. "On your knees, hands where I can see them. You could have killed me." "Could have, didn't. That's the difference between us, Robert. I choose not to destroy things." She heard horses approaching, Pete and the hands drawn by the gunshot. "But I will protect what's mine." Spirit moved to stand beside her horse, both animals calm under her familiar presence. Below, smoke still rose from the ranch, but she could see riders moving to fight the fires. They would save what mattered. They would rebuild what was lost. She kept her rifle trained on Robert until Pete and the others arrived with rope and grim expressions. Only then did she lower the gun, feeling the weight of the morning's choices settle into her bones. "You all right, Miss Sarah?" Pete asked quietly as they bound Robert's hands. She touched her mother's locket, thinking of all the strong women who had come before her, who had faced their own battles on their own terms. "Yes," she said, and meant it. "I'm exactly where I need to be." James's father's rifle still smoked in Sarah's hands when she heard the thunder of approaching hooves. Through the dust and haze of the dying fires, she saw James riding hard toward the ranch, his face etched with worry that melted into relief at the sight of her. He swung down before his horse fully stopped, crossing the yard in long strides. "Saw the smoke from the high pasture, rode back fast as I could." His eyes took in the rifle, her dusty clothes, the controlled chaos of firefighters and ranch hands. "You all right?" "We all are," Sarah assured him. "Robert's in custody, for good this time. The fires are nearly out." As if summoned by her words, Spirit trotted up, nudging James's shoulder in greeting. The stallion bore a few rope burns, but was otherwise unharmed. James ran a hand down his neck, checking for injuries, then looked back at Sarah with dawning understanding. "Pete told me what you did," he said quietly. "Tracking Robert alone, making that shot." "Not alone," Sarah corrected, watching as their neighbors continued working to secure the ranch. "Never alone out here." The Thompson men had brought their water wagon, while Martha Reed and the other women had organized a bucket line to protect. The chapel, even Mrs. Thompson was there, her fine dress ruined with smoke and water stains as she worked alongside Cookie to feed the firefighters. "The chapel survived," James said, following her gaze. "Bit smoky, but nothing that can't be." "Fixed before?" He stopped, suddenly uncertain. "That is, if you still want." Sarah silenced him with a kiss that tasted of smoke and certainty. Around them, a few whoops and whistles rose from the hands, quickly hushed by Pete's stern look. "Takes more than a fire to stop a wedding at Fallen." "Star Ranch," she said firmly, "though we might need to air out my mother's dress a bit." James laughed, the sound carrying across the yard and bringing smiles to tired faces. Then he sobered, touching the rifle she still held. "This was my father's favorite. Said it never let him down. Like father, like son." Sarah said softly, "Neither of you let me down either." The sheriff arrived then with his deputies, ready to transport Robert to a more secure jail in Tucson. Sarah watched her former fiancé being led away, noting how small he looked now, how his fine clothes had turned to dust and defeat. "Got something to say to me?" Robert sneered as they passed. Sarah considered him for a moment, then shook her head. "Nothing at all. You're part of a past I've outgrown." The day stretched long as they restored order to the ranch. Fences needed mending, scared cattle needed gentling, and the chapel's new whitewash had to be redone, but willing hands made light work, and by sunset the crisis had transformed into something like a celebration. Cookie produced a feast from seemingly nowhere, and Martha Reed brought out a jug of her famous apple cider. Someone started playing a fiddle, and soon the ranch yard filled with music and laughter. "Look at them," James said softly, standing with Sarah on the porch. "A few months ago, half these folks wouldn't give you the time of day. Now they're ready to fight fire and outlaws to see us married proper." "People can surprise you," Sarah replied, watching Mrs. Thompson teach Lucy Chen a Virginia reel while Spirit looked on curiously from his corral. "Sometimes they just need a chance to show their better nature." James pulled her close, both of them smelling of smoke and hard work. "Speaking of chances," he murmured, "thank you for taking one on a dusty ranch and a weather-beaten cowboy." Sarah touched her mother's locket, then reached for James's father's rifle where it rested against the porch rail. "These aren't just things anymore," she said. "They're proof of where we've been, who we've become together." The music swelled as Pete joined in with his harmonica, playing the sweet, slow tune that had become their song. Above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, as bright and promising as the future stretching out before them. "Dance with me?" James asked, offering his hand. Sarah took it without hesitation, following him into the circle of light. And music and family they'd built together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new lessons in love and trust. But tonight, they would celebrate standing their ground, protecting their home, and choosing each other despite every obstacle life had thrown in their path. The marriage license lay on the chapel's small altar, fresh ink glistening in the morning light. Sarah stood in what had once been James's mother's room, now transformed by Martha and the other women into a bridal chamber. Her wedding dress was simple. Crisp white cotton trimmed with lace that the Chen women had contributed, cut and sewn by her own hands to reflect who she'd become. "Something borrowed," Martha said, pinning her mother's veil into Sarah's hair. "Something blue," Jessica added, tying a faded ribbon around her bouquet of desert wildflowers. Lucy Chen stepped forward shyly with a string of tiny pearls. "Something new from my father's trade route." "And something old," Sarah whispered, touching her mother's locket. Through the window, she could see the transformed ranch yard. Bunting fluttered between the posts, and rows of chairs faced the chapel's open doors. Cookie had outdone himself with an arch of desert flowers, and even Spirit had a ribboned bridle for his role as ring-bearer. Pete's idea that had made James laugh out loud when suggested. "It's time," Martha said softly. Sarah took one last look in the mirror. The woman who gazed back wasn't the frightened bride from the station platform, nor even the determined rancher who'd faced down Robert. She was something new, a blend of East and West, of gentle strength and hard-won wisdom. The chapel bells began to ring, another of Pete's surprises, restored just for this day. Sarah descended the stairs to find Cookie waiting, his usual gruffness softened by obvious emotion. "Ain't right for a bride to walk alone," he said roughly. "Would you do me the honor?" Sarah kissed his weathered cheek. "I'd be proud to." Music began. Mary Wilson at the piano, Pete with his harmonica, and 3 ranch hands with fiddles. Not quite a church organ, but perfect for a ranch wedding. Sarah took Cookie's arm, and together they stepped into the sunlight. James waited at the altar, wearing his best suit with his father's watch chain gleaming against the vest. His eyes found hers and held, speaking volumes without a word. Behind him stood Thompson, their reconciled neighbor serving as best man, a bridge between past troubles and future peace. The ceremony itself was simple, fitting for people who valued actions over words. They spoke their vows clearly, their promises witnessed by the land they loved and the people they'd come to. Call family. When James slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, Sarah saw tears in Martha's eyes, pride in Cookie's, and joy in every face that had once looked at her with suspicion. "By the power vested in me," the preacher said, "and with the blessing of God in this company, I now pronounce you man and wife." Their first kiss as husband and wife tasted of promise and morning sun. The chapel erupted in cheers, and someone, probably Pete, let out a joyous whoop that set everyone laughing. The celebration spilled out into the yard, where tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every ranch and farm for miles around. Children played between the adults' legs, dogs begged for scraps, and even the cattle in the nearby pasture seemed to low their approval. "Mrs. McKinnon," James murmured in her ear as they moved between well-wishers, "has a nice sound to it." "Partner," Sarah corrected with a smile. "We agreed, partners in all things." He laughed and pulled her close. "Partners then, in life, in work, in whatever comes our way." The afternoon passed in a blur of congratulations, dancing, and moments that would become family legends. Cookie unveiled a wedding cake that somehow combined Sarah's mother's recipe with Western practicality. Spirit performed his ring-bearing duties with surprising dignity, even if he did try to eat the flowers afterward. Mrs. Thompson led the dancing with unexpected vigor, teaching the younger generation the steps her own mother had brought from Virginia. As sunset painted the sky in wedding colors, Sarah found herself back on the porch where she'd first begun to fall in love with this hard, beautiful land. James joined her, bringing 2 cups of Martha's cider. "Having any regrets," he asked softly, "about choosing this life?" Sarah looked out at their gathered family, blood and chosen alike. Pete was teaching Lucy to ride while her parents looked on nervously. Cookie was sharing recipes with Martha. Thompson and his wife were already planning the next cattle drive. With their combined herds, "Only one," she said, eyes twinkling. "I regret not getting off that train sooner." James pulled her close as the first stars appeared above Fallen Star Ranch. Behind them the music and laughter continued, but here on their porch the moment belonged to them alone. "Welcome home," he whispered, "for good and always." Sarah leaned into him, feeling the strength and certainty of their shared future. "I already was." 1 year later, Sarah sat in the ranch house parlor, recording the day's events in the family Bible. Her careful hand noted births, marriages, and the small victories that made up ranch life. James's parents' entries filled the first pages, and now their own story continued the legacy. Outside, autumn painted the desert in subtle golds and purples. Through the window she could see James teaching young Tommy Thompson to ride, using the same gentle patience he'd once shown her. The boy had been spending more time at Fallen Star lately, drawn by James's quiet strength and Sarah's fresh-baked cookies. "Miss Sarah!" Lucy Chen's voice carried from the kitchen. "The bread's ready!" Sarah smiled, touching her mother's locket before rising. Lucy had become a regular visitor too, eager to learn both Eastern refinements and Western skills. Today, they were teaching Cookie new recipes, blending Sarah's mother's cookbook with Western practicality. The kitchen was warm with the scent of baking and friendship. Cookie pretended to grumble about too many women in his domain, but his eyes shone with pride at their successful experiments. The ranch hands had stopped complaining about being used as taste testers months ago. "Martha's coming by later," Lucy said, carefully removing golden loaves from the oven. "She's bringing more fabric for the new quilt." The quilting circle had become a weekly tradition, drawing women from across the territory. They shared more than stitches and patterns. News was exchanged, advice given, and support offered to those who needed it. Sarah had even started teaching some of the younger girls to read, using the same determination that had once taught herself. Pete appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "Telegram from the station, Mrs. McKinnon. Thought you'd want to see it right." "Away!" Sarah read the message twice, joy blooming in her chest. Another woman had been saved from Robert's schemes. The station master recognizing his pattern from Sarah's warning letter. The woman was currently stranded in Prescott, and the telegram asked if Fallen Star Ranch might have room for another lost soul. "Tell them yes," Sarah said firmly. "And Pete, take the good wagon. Make sure she knows she's not alone." As Pete rode out, Sarah saw James watching from the corral. He lifted his hand in question, and she nodded. His smile was all the confirmation she needed. They'd built this refuge together, turning their own story into shelter for others. The afternoon brought more visitors. Thompson and his wife came to discuss the shared grazing arrangements that had turned former rivals into allies. Their success had inspired other ranchers to cooperate rather than compete, strengthening the whole community. Spirit, now the proud father of several promising colts, nickered a greeting from his pasture. The stallion had become a symbol of the ranch's breeding program, his gentle strength passing down to a new generation. Like everything at Fallen Star, he represented the perfect blend of Eastern grace and Western resilience. As evening approached, Sarah stood on their porch, watching the sunset paint familiar colors across their land. James joined her, smelling of horses and honest work. "Good day?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. "The best kind," she replied, leaning into him, full of life and hope and possibility. They stood together, watching their world settle into evening. From the bunkhouse came the sound of Pete's harmonica playing their wedding song, while Cookie's voice rose in mock protest about tomorrow's breakfast plans. Lucy and Tommy chased fireflies in the yard, their laughter carrying on the cooling air. Sarah touched her mother's locket, then the small swell of her belly, where their own next chapter was just beginning to show. "Did you ever imagine," she asked softly, "that one missed connection at a train station could lead to all this?" James turned her in his arms, his face serious. "Nothing was missed that day, Sarah. Everything and everyone arrived exactly when and where they were meant to be. The first stars appeared above Fallen Star Ranch, bright as dreams and twice as true. Sarah looked out at the life they'd built, the garden growing green against desert odds, the chapel where they now held weekly gatherings, the barn full of horses gentled with patience and love. Every inch of it was home, every moment a gift. She'd never imagined when she first stepped off that train. "You're right," she said, reaching up to touch his weathered face. "Some connections aren't missed at all. They're just waiting for the right moment to begin."